Hi, Richard.
Hi, Dimitar.
You're in the hot seat now, so we continue the discussion about industrial perspectives and a bit more practical experience and practical solutions, hopefully. So first, maybe for our audience, for online viewers, tell us a bit more about BMS and your footprint in Europe.
Yep, so Bristol Squibb, for those of you not familiar with the business, is a global biopharmaceutical company headquartered in the US, but with a very proud footprint here in Europe. Our mission is to transform patients' lives through science, and that mission brings us to Europe. We have a very significant footprint here with 6,000 employees across the region. We have 3 fantastic R&D and manufacturing sites in Spain, Ireland, and the Netherlands. And we run hundreds of clinical trials across the European Union in almost every corner of the region, which are a really important part of our R&D process. Each one of those trials is generating investment and growth into the European economy, but most importantly, providing patients with access to therapies that they might otherwise not be able to access. So we're really proud of our footprint in Europe. My role here in Brussels is to work with the institutions and with governments across member states to make sure that European patients are able to access the end results of all of this incredible R&D, the medicines themselves. And finally, I'll just say that we're proud to be part of an incredible industry which is generating real growth and productivity gains across the EU. There's more than 2 million jobs generated by the pharmaceutical industry in the European Union. It's a sector that was identified in the Draghi report as being of strategic importance, and therefore we're absolutely committed to working with the institutions to boost life sciences competitiveness.
Yeah, I mean, specific importance of the sector indeed. When we talk about technology, we kind of veer off into geopolitics, digital, ChatGPT, but it's good maybe to take this conversation further when it comes to actual patient treatments. And tell us a bit more when it comes to technology. We had a wake-up call during the pandemic, of course, but hopefully we've moved on, lessons learned. But when it comes to technology, what is your company doing when it comes to consumer welfare, early diagnostics, or overall consumer welfare in this regard?
So this is a real golden era for technology and the interface between tech and biology and chemistry. It's an incredibly exciting time in healthcare. AI is transforming early diagnosis, and that's really important. Anybody with any engagement in healthcare will know that the earlier you're able to diagnose a disease, the faster you're able to start treatment, and the better the outcomes for the patient. And so we're seeing some really exciting advances, for example, in the application of AI in diagnosing cardiomyopathy. So people may not be familiar with the condition, but this is a cardiac condition, one which is incredibly serious. If you ever hear stories about young, fit sports people having a cardiac arrest on the pitch, that's often related to cardiomyopathy. So it is incredibly hard to diagnose. Less than 20% of patients have actually got the diagnosis, and that's largely because it's reliant on one very simple bit of technology, which is an ECG, but a highly trained cardiologist alongside that ECG, and so it's a very time-consuming process to find the cases. We've used AI to streamline this process, flag those patients which are at most risk of cardiomyopathy, ensure they're seen by a cardiologist, and we've got a number of cases now where patients have been diagnosed who had no symptoms, no idea that they were at risk. So a really good example of how AI is speeding diagnosis and improving outcomes. The other area I'll touch on in technology is one that we're heavily invested in. We have 2 CAR-T therapies approved for use in Europe, and this is really what I describe as kind of the science fiction frontier of healthcare. CAR-Ts are cell therapies, cell and gene therapies, and the concept here is you extract a patient's T cells, their immune cells, process them in a lab, engineer them, and effectively superpower them. You then grow them so you have millions of superpowered cells that you can then infuse back into the patient's body so that those cells and the patient can fight the cancer themselves.
And this is specifically fine-tuned to the individual?
Fine-tuned, personalized to the individual, and highly complex. So that's where we are today. It's being used in a small number of blood cancers, but what we expect over the coming years is for that targeted therapy cell and gene therapy to be expanded into whole new frontiers of healthcare, chronic conditions like arthritis or lupus, far more patients to reach, but far greater outcomes as well.
Sounds like the 22nd century to me.
Yeah, absolutely. But we need to regulate today for that 22nd century future.
Yeah. And here comes the conundrum here in Europe, because we have this, fantastic track record when it comes to not only educated personnel, not only, university academia, but also research and development, R&D. We throw a lot of money when it comes to R&D. How do we translate this money and this expertise into actual growth and actual innovation?
Yeah, I'll say up front that Europe clearly has world-class science. We see that every day in the partnerships that we have with academic institutions, with scientific bodies, through the Horizon program where we are heavily invested. You ask about the transition, though. There are a couple of barriers. There are things that are holding us and Europe back when it comes to competitiveness in R&D. The first one I'll mention is clinical trials.
Yep.
I said at the start, they're at the heart of the R&D process. A very significant investment of time and money behind every medicine. And right now we see a regulatory system which is still far too divided. And as a result, the EU's share of commercial clinical trials has roughly halved over the last decade. That is a damning statistic, and it's a decline that we need to stop if Europe's going to succeed in this space. How to do that? We need better harmonization. Too often, companies like BMS are having to deal with 27 individual member states when Europe has that potential to work as one single harmonized regulatory system. And we also need to speed up approval for clinical trials. Speed is of the essence when you're dealing with a highly competitive global environment like this.
Yeah, this is...
The other aspect here is that companies like BMS invest in R&D and clinical trials where we have an expectation that those medicines will ultimately be reimbursed and used in the health systems, and too often that isn't the case in European states. Only around half of the medicines that are approved and used in the US are actually available in Europe.
Only half?
Only half. And so what that means is that Europe is then able to unlock less investment in R&D as a result. And this comes back to the approach to the way in which a lot of European states value medicines, value medical innovation, and we really need to see a change in mindset, one from cost containment to recognition that investing in medicines is an investment in individual healthcare, societal well-being, ultimately productivity and growth. You mentioned COVID.
Yeah.
If we've learned anything from COVID, it is that scientific innovation can help transform health outcomes and have a direct link with economic productivity.
Absolutely, I hear loud and clear. You mentioned artificial intelligence a couple minutes ago, and I was just wondering, I guess, as you mentioned, AI and machine learning and all of these applications are very useful in innovation and also making headway in your work. Is there a problem with using these kind of technologies here in Europe when it comes to day-to-day applicability of AI or machine learning or whatever it is related to it in your work in Europe?
Yeah.
Any restrictions or?
So we've embedded AI in a lot of what we do. I know I mentioned one example earlier, but it is transforming the way that we discover and develop medicines, because that process is incredibly data heavy, and AI, as we all know, has that ability to simplify and speed the way in which data is analyzed. In particular, in clinical trials, AI allows us to identify patients who might benefit from a trial quickly. It helps us deliver clinical trial reports far more fast. So we're actually on the cusp, we think, of taking 3 years out of the clinical trial time frame. It often takes 10 years to trial a product. If we can take 3 years out because of AI, that is an incredible advance. So yes, we need to see a regulatory framework and an environment that's supportive of exactly that kind of aspiration, one that is sufficiently flexible to adapt to a very fast-moving scientific environment. And I'm hopeful that we'll get there.
And are the people in Brussels, in the Berlaymont, are they open to this kind of messaging?
They are absolutely open to it, and we're expecting a Biotech Act to be published next week. And I am hopeful that it will contain some of what we're talking about here and improvements to the clinical trial environment and a recognition of the pace of change in medical innovation.
Yeah, I mean, just mentioning the fact that it takes us twice as long for medical trials tells you something about our longevity, about the perspectives, and where the whole thing is moving. So this is a really important point. We have a couple minutes left, and I'm tempted to talk about the transatlantic side of things. I mean, let's be honest. There's been some tensions when it comes to trade. When it comes to politics, and I'm also reminded of what happened 5 years ago when it came to COVID, disruption of supply chains, again nationalism and all of that. Hopefully, we've passed that. But when it comes to pharmaceuticals, do you see and do you feel this sense of pressure when it comes to EU-US collaboration? And do we have actual overlaps and areas where we can collaborate better as a Western bloc, as allies as well?
Yep. So look, we're a science-led company. We will always be guided by the science. That's why we're invested in Europe. But clearly we are not immune to the geopolitical context. I'm aware we're kind of talking at a time when the temperature has ratcheted up another couple of degrees in the last couple of days. Our industry and BMS has always supported the situation that we had only last year when tariffs were in a very different place, but medicines have been exempted from those tariffs for 40 years. That's been a core part of the WTO agreement, and for good reason. Medicines are not a standardized product. They're essential for human health, and we've seen that perfectly in the COVID situation. So tariffs on medicines, we've highlighted concerns on both sides of the Atlantic that kind of thing can disrupt supply chains. We operate with highly globalized supply chains. It can jeopardize patients' access to medicines and ultimately therefore have harm to individuals. So we're advocating for globalized, full and free trade in medicines. I do worry about the reaction and the risk of a spiral of European preference response and that kind of thing. But I hope that all of us can stay focused on the end user, and that's the patients. Because if we focus on the patient and the fact that they need to have access to medicines today and the next breakthroughs tomorrow, then I'm sure we'll get to the right place.
Yeah, and with the Martin Center, by the way, with the previous US administration, we did a lot of work on the Trade and Technology Council between the EU and US. There was a setup of different working groups for a variety of issues, supply chains, semiconductors, and discussing with colleagues and staffers. And there was also discussion about potential avenues for collaboration in biotech, on applying AI in exactly the fields we're talking about. So can we at least remain hopeful that for the years to come we can still have this kind of dialogue for joint overlaps when it comes to things of mutual interest?
Yeah, I hope so. Science only advances with collaboration between states, between regions, between private and public sector, and we've got lots of great examples of that in Europe and in the US over the years. And I'm hopeful that kind of level of partnership and collaboration can continue.
Yeah. And final question, you mentioned the Biotech Act. This is something which doesn't, pop up in our usual news feeds or something. Give us a 20-second teaser about biotech and potential regulating or empowering this side of things in Europe.
Well, I can tell you what I'd like to see in the Biotech Act, which is an improved, harmonized system for clinical trials in Europe, something which is really holding us back. I talked earlier about how Europe's competitiveness on that front has declined over the years. China is fast surpassing Europe's clinical trial performance. So that's one area that we absolutely need to see in the Biotech Act. I'd also like to see action on intellectual property protections. This is a real hot topic when it comes to innovative pharmaceuticals, and other regions around the world attracting more investment are doing so because they have stronger regimes for intellectual property protection. Innovative biopharma is intellectual property.
Biopharma is intellectual property. Richard, thank you so much for this conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Robinson, one of the vice presidents of BMS. Round of applause. Alicia, thank you very much.